Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Great to see you all. Thank you for coming. We couldn't be more thrilled for the topic today and the speaker. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here, okay? But keep chewing as I, get out the standard fare here. So we are just absolutely thrilled to welcome Mark Pennington here, professor of political economy at King's this summer. Had the chance to grab coffee with Mark earlier this summer. We compared notes. There's just so many synergies and opportunities to collaborate between political economy at King's and our community here at the workshop. So this is just kind of one step in that direction. We recently even signed a letter of agreement to deepen some of those connections, which is terrific. So bother Mark, in other words, for his amazing research as well as for opportunities to connect here. So he's been department chair, thankless yeoman service, but did it so well from as you know all too well, Angie, Jess, others, from 2016 to 2020, and now directs the Center for the Study of Governance and Society. Has a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Among other things, he's co-author of Planning and Political Market, Robust Political Economy, and Foucault and Liberal Political Economy. And today, of course, the talk is going to be focused on the Ostroms and Foucault, on the ideal of self-governance. And we just couldn't be more thrilled. It's a perfect framing and really does a great job of this year that we're focusing on democracy, trust, and institutions. So you're here. You can be here, Claudia. Are you sure? No, there's room. Oh, there's room. There's room. So without further ado, Mark, just the floor is yours, and thanks so much again for being here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Scott. And it's really an honor to speak to this group. This is a place that's been in my sort of intellectual imagination for many years. So to actually come here is really something quite special. So as Scott just mentioned, I've recently, it's just come out in the last couple of months, I've written this book, Foucault and Liberal Political Economy, Power, Knowledge and Freedom. So the aim of that book is to explore possible connections between Foucault's ideas and those of what I call a postmodern liberalism. So the book is really about having a conversation between Foucault and different streams of thought within the liberal political economy tradition. Now, some people might think that is in some ways quite an unusual move, because Foucault is often considered to be, in some ways, almost antithetical liberalism, where he thinks about certain problems. And I think that's certainly true of some of his followers in what you might call the sort of loosely Foucauldian tradition in social and political theory. But Foucault himself, what his own views were, is really quite a problematic character. It's not easy to pin him down. And there's been quite a lot of work done in recent years suggesting that towards the end of his career, he moved towards a position that was, at least in a gentle way, endorsing certain aspects of liberalism. And what I do in my book is not actually come to an evaluation of whether or not Foucault did actually move in the direction of liberalism. What I try to do is look at his core theoretical concepts and to see whether or not they might be compatible with certain strands in liberalism, and what those compatibilities might be, what the terms of a conversation between these traditions might actually entail. Now, in the book, I don't actually cover the Ostroms that much. I do refer to them as thinkers of self-governance. You might have some commonality with Foucault, but they're not the primary focus of attention in this particular book. So what I thought I might do for the presentation today is to set out what I think might be potentially fertile terrain, to have a conversation between Ostrom's sort of political economy framework and some of Foucault's core ideas. And what I'd like to do is to focus on what I refer to as the ideal of self-governance in these different traditions. So what I'll begin by doing is sketching out the different elements of the Ostrom's conception of self-governance in relation to their understanding of the individual and of their political economy of institutions and decisions. I'll then set out, as I see it, the key elements of Foucault's discourse theoretic social theory and philosophy. And I'll argue that the common thread connecting these two schools of thought is a critique, a thoroughgoing critique of sovereign power and a resulting sympathy for fractured systems of political economic authority that give people more space to exercise a kind of creative freedom. I'll conclude, though, by pointing to some tensions between these perspectives by suggesting that Foucault's approach points towards a still more radical critique of sovereignty than the Ostroms were perhaps willing to countenance. So that's the kind of order for the presentation. So let me start off by speaking a little bit about my understanding of the Ostroms and their relationship to questions around self-governance. So I think it helps to situate their perspective by speaking initially about their understanding of the individual agent. This is going to become very important when we start to talk about Foucault later on in the presentation. So the Ostroms subscribe to what I would describe as a situated model of rational choice, a situated model of rational choice. So they are both methodological individualists and, to a degree, I would suggest, normative individualists, but this individualism is a culturally situated individualism. It is not an atomistic form of individualism. So that is the critical point, I think, that needs to be recognized before we move on any further. So for the Ostroms, individuals are purposeful actors who respond to incentives, and they interact with other individuals who do likewise. But individuals on this view are not purely rational actors because they are cognitively limited. Their rationality is always bounded. So what people think is rational is constituted or conditioned in part by habits and routines acquired from the socio-cultural environment in which agents find themselves. So there's an important emphasis, I think, on habits, routines, norms, traditions, these sorts of things within which individuals are situated. That's a critical point. So it's a form of individualism, but to re-emphasize, it is not an atomistic form of individualism, which speaks of pre-social individual agents. Now, within that political economy of institutions and decisions, well, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the role of institutions. So institutions for the Ostroms shape the incentives that agents face. These incentives affect the extent to which agents interact in positive-sum games, which secure the benefits of social cooperation, or whether they engage in zero-sum, negative-sum activity. So institutional structure, if you like, kind of games that people play in the social world. By institutions, they refer to formal rules, such as rules of property, the presence or absence of private property, communal property, state property, and the relationship between different layers of government and legal systems, which enforce rights and responsibilities at various levels. So formal rules in this sense also include things like constitutional arrangements. All of these kind of nested institutional arrangements affect the incentives facing individuals. Institutions for the Ostroms, though, also include informal rules. So this is cultural traditions, the routines, the habits of mind and beliefs about individuals themselves and the communities that they inhabit, and how these tacit or informal sort of presuppositions to their thought inform their understanding of the games that they're playing. Okay, so this is the idea of culture, informality, actually affecting the kind of incentive structures. And we can think about, therefore, the relationship between the informal rules, the cultural beliefs and the routines, formal rules, and how they, through a kind of complex interaction, shape the kind of incentives that actors face. This is how I understand what the Ostroms are about. And this gives rise to both a positive political economy analysis, attempt to understand how institutions in given circumstances actually function, but also it gives rise to a kind of normative account of what ideal institutions of governance might actually look like. So in terms of positive analysis, the Ostroms, I think, use positive or empirical forms of inquiry to illustrate the potential for bottom-up solutions to various kinds of social problems. So on this kind of an account, by observing empirically in the world, we can find examples where bottom-up groupings of individuals can often solve problems of cooperation and coordination, such as managing common pool resources, more effectively than systems that empower top-down actors who impose from on high a particular set of rules or procedures. Now, the account that understands this kind of empirical set of observations, I think, focuses on the significance of what I would refer to as epistemic constraints. So one of the reasons why, in the Ostrom's view, that top-down systems often malfunction is that they misrecognize the choice situation facing the actors on the ground. So because the distant actors are cognitively limited, they can't necessarily understand the nature of the game that actors on the ground are actually playing. So when they propose institutions from on high, those institutions often don't fit with the kind of belief systems or informal operating procedures of the actors on the ground. So this is an epistemic kind of argument. It's an argument rooted in claims about where knowledge actually resides, about the kinds of relationships that exist between people. On the Ostrom's account, incentives matter. But, and this I think is the crucial point, they are situationally varied. So I think for the Ostroms, there is no universal homo economicus. There's no universal homo economicus. There is only a pluralistic, culturally situated one. And it's precisely because of that pluralism and cultural diversity, if you like, that external agents who try to impose a unified homo economicus model on agents when they're designing institutions often lead to a kind of misfiring of those institutions. But this is what comes out in Eleanor's account of governing the commons, where the imposition of the grid of a kind of unitary free rider model, which suggests that the only way to overcome commons problems is to either have imposed privatization or imposed state ownership, are both examples of that. So the people in this case who are designing the privatization or the state ownership don't have the culturally varied knowledge to actually understand what that will do to the actors on the ground as they face their choice situations, if you like. So it's out of this analysis, as I understand it, that the Ostroms derive, if you like, normative institutional implications. It's because people are limited in knowledge that we should limit the scope for some to exercise power and rule over others. Given the kind of epistemic constraints that all agents face, we should allow people the greatest scope to craft their own rules and institutions from the bottom up. We should presume, if you like, in favor of a kind of bottom-up pluralism. On the Ostrom's account, if you deprive people of the scope to develop their own rules and address their own problems, then you give them no reason to try and be self-governing agents. You create, in effect, relations of dependency between those who are the rulers, those who hand down rules, and those who are the ruled. And those who are the ruled in many situations actually have the knowledge that might be better adapted to create the kind of rules that might actually address various kinds of problems. Now, there is also, I think, in the Ostrom's view here, an attack on what I would describe as centralized social contract models, which imply that there is a singular contract which people subscribe to, and that kind of reproduces a sort of unitary notion of society. So I think on the Ostrom's view, contracts do matter, but these contracts are situationally varied. There's no single social contract. There's no single social entity. There's actually a plurality of potential contracts that people might contract into or potentially contract out of. So pluralism in contracting, I think, is central to the Ostrom's situated rational choice or situated public choice kind of an account. Now, as we know, this does not imply for the Ostroms that there is no place for centralized hierarchies. It's not an argument against all forms of central authority, but it does suggest that given the epistemic constraints, centralized authority should, for the large part, be focused on issues of dispute resolution, where, if you like, the plural rationalities of these diverse communities and individuals come into conflict with one another. So conflict resolution is fundamental to the Ostrom's view of what more centralized institutional structures should actually be focused upon. So on this kind of an account, the central state should facilitate freedom and self-governance. It should not act in ways that block or smother capacity for agents to be free and self-governing communities. Now, that kind of idea, I think, is articulated most clearly in their account of, if you like, a polycentric constitution. The idea of a constitutional order which has a role for centralized authority, but where there are multiple other layers within which agents, either individually or acting in concert with others, can exercise self-governing powers. So what matters in a polycentric constitution is the relationship between these levels of rulemaking. It mustn't be the case, I think, for the Ostroms, both Vincent and Eleanor, that bottom-up actors are essentially just branch plants of a top-down structure. It must be that there's a kind of subsidiarity model, where to a large extent, whatever powers are granted to higher levels come from the self-governing acts of more bottom-up level agents. I think this is a critical point. I think their view also gives rise to a very specific understanding of what intellectuals should do. So they see themselves as not, if you like, top-down experts, but egalitarian advisors who consult with people as they face various problems to engage in this kind of artisanship, institutional artisanship from the bottom up. And that implies a kind of attitude of humility towards those that you're interacting with, rather than an assumption that the social scientists know best. So the social scientists are in no better position than some kind of expert planner who believes that they actually know how resources should be managed. It requires this kind of attitude of humility towards the subjects of the investigation. So, what about Michel Foucault? I've set out the Ostroms. How can we think of Foucault as, if you like, a theorist of self-governance in ways that might have parallels with the Ostroms' approach? Well, in one sense, you might think this is a really strange project, because you might be of the view, as some people are, that Foucault is a representative of schools of thought that give little, if any, role to individual agency in shaping social outcomes. But I think this is a profoundly mistaken view. Foucault is famous for rejecting the idea of rational, autonomous individual or subject. The individual who has an underlying truth free from the effects of culture and history. But to recognize that does not imply that Foucault rejects the idea of personal agency. In his view, what we think we are, how we relate to others, and what we consider to be rational does not reflect some underlying human nature or essence, but is an effect of, as he would put it, the specific discourses, narrative frames, and the regimes of truth in which we are situated. Crucially, while these discourses and regimes of truth shape our sense of ourselves, they do not determine it. They do not determine it. People, on Foucault's view, can exercise creative agency through acts of what he calls resistance, which can morph their conceptions of themselves and their surroundings into something new, into something different. What he's concerned about is precisely the kind of institutional arrangements that close down the scope for this resistance. So although people can never be fully autonomous, or as he would put it, they can never be free of power, they do have the scope to reshape themselves and their communities and their surroundings in the face of power. What he's concerned about is the kind of arrangements that close that space down. So for Foucault, there is no freedom or agency outside of what he calls discourse power. What freedom and agency require is that discourse is subject to pluralistic contestation and resistance, so that whatever understandings it establishes can be destabilized or challenged. Freedom and agency are threatened when what Foucault calls the relationship between discursive and non-discursive institutions, and by non-discursive institutions, he's referring to things like property, constitutions, the legal system, this sort of thing, freeze or rigidify in a way that blocks the scope for creative resistance and for challenge. Now, in Foucault's account, we have also, and I think this parallels quite neatly with Ostrom's views, a kind of, if you like, positive type of analysis, which is a kind of description of how power works in the world, and also a kind of normative account that sort of falls out of this for the kind of institutional arrangements that might allow people to exercise this creative agency or resistance in the face of power. And as we'll see in a few minutes, this is the area where I think there's a lot of space for dialogue between an Ostromian approach and a kind of Foucauldian understanding of power. Now, in Foucault's account of what he calls discourse power, he's focused on the threats to creative agency from totalizing modernist discourses, especially in the human and social sciences. And as he would put it, the technologies of government that tend to go along with these discourses. He interprets these discourses as a form of what he refers to as power knowledge, where scientific truth claims made by various experts are a manifestation of a Nietzschean will to power. The attempt by those who claim a certain level of expertise to impose their perspective on the world, to impose a grid of understanding, not only on themselves, if you like, but on the agents who are subject to these forms of understanding. And he identifies two of these modernist discourses, which he sees as particular threats. So the first are what he refers to as disciplinary discourses. So disciplinary discourses target, if you like, deviant or disorderly individuals. And they operate through systems of observation and surveillance that claim to know into the soul of the actor who is observed. So disciplinary discourses claim to know the soul of the criminal, of the homosexual, of the insane. And having achieved this understanding, they're able to, if you like, correct the deviance by subjecting the criminal, the homosexual, or the insane, or whatever the category may be, to some kind of corrective technique. Now, that could be a kind of scientific technique of the sort that psychiatrists or sexologists might use, but it might also be that simply by the fact that people know they're being watched, they modify their behavior, they modify their deviance, precisely because they know they're being watched by the gaze of these disciplinary forces. The second type of modernist discourse that Foucault identifies are what he refers to as biopolitical discourses. Now, these discourses do not target deviant individuals, they target entire populations. They focus on the population level. They claim that by identifying various, what we might refer to as disequilibria or pattern anomalies, various corrective techniques can be introduced in a society that will operate in such a way as to maximize the welfare of the population. Okay, so in this case, it is not the individual that is known or subject to surveillance. It is the whole of the society that is subject to a kind of classificatory or ordering grid. These kind of techniques typically govern through statistics, which claim to know the societal phenomena that they target. So there's a focus on statistical aggregates, which can be manipulated in a way that will produce an enhancement in the welfare of the population, or subgroups perhaps within the population. What Foucault refers to as biopower often governs at a distance. And this is a terminology that a lot of people in the Foucauldian tradition refer to. So it does not typically govern through direct commands or orders. It governs instead through various forms of target setting, auditing and reporting rules, performance management indicators, the issuance of taxes, subsidies, or contracts that crucially are tied to the production of data. Okay, so you have to produce data to show that you're achieving some kind of target, goal, or objective, and through that you might be rewarded. This is or penalized. So this is the way that the biopower operates. It stimulates people to prove that they are achieving in various ways abstract targets and goals. Now, in Foucault's view, very often, both these disciplinary techniques and biopolitical techniques do not work on their own terms. Why is that? Well, it's because they do reflect what are, as he would see it, essentially perspectival truth claims. Okay, they reflect the knowledge of the observer, but not necessarily that of the observed. Okay, so it's a narrow perspective that is being imposed on other actors. So we wouldn't expect, therefore, this to be an accurate reflection, if you like, of the circumstances that those agents subject to these disciplinary or biopolitical gazes actually face or understand themselves. But even if they don't work in the sense of achieving the objectives they claim to have, these techniques can still have, as Foucault would understand it, power effects. Now, what he means by that is that by being subject to these techniques, by being encased in the maze of rules and regulations that they create, they can have identity effects on the person who's subject to these kind of gazes. So if you're having to sort of kowtow to some kind of disciplinary or biopolitical authority, irrespective of whether its techniques work in the sense of delivering some outcome, it affects your identity. Okay, you're not seeing yourself, if you like, as a self-governing agent. You're seeing yourself as a deviant or as a supplicant to some form of bureaucratic authority. So on this kind of a view, people's scope for agency to become a different understanding of themselves can be threatened by get to these kind of techniques, irrespective of whether they actually achieve their scientific aims or objectives. So that's the kind of positive analysis, if you like. But there's also an important normative thread that comes out of Foucault's understanding in this regard. And that thread is what I would describe as a relentless attack on the concept of sovereignty at multiple different levels. So the first level is the attack on the myth of the sovereign individual. Okay, the idea that there is an individual with an underlying essence that's fully autonomous in the decisions it makes. This conception of the individual for Foucault is normatively dangerous because it risks locking people into fixed conceptions of themselves, which are supposed to reveal that particular truth. It masks the complex of social factors that shape who people think they are, and it blocks or can block creative experimentation with new possibilities for selfhood. The second focus of this normative Foucauldian critique is the myth of sovereign power. Okay, so the notion that power is something that resides in a specific place or a given set of actors needs to be undermined because it tends to focus, as Foucault would see it, normative attention in the wrong place. Usually the wrong place for Foucault is the state. Okay, so it's not the state itself that is the threat. It is rather, as Foucault would understand it, the discourses that constitute the state and the kind of actions it takes. So his concern, if you like, is with states that have been colonized by disciplinary and biopolitical discourses that lead states to act in certain ways and that construct those who are subject to these techniques in various sorts of ways. So what matters for Foucault is not so much that you should resist the state in this case, although perhaps you should, but you should be resisting the discourses that are constituting the state and the kind of forms of governance that is actually engaged with. Now, as part of that, Foucault also challenges the myth of the sovereign state. So by that, what he's challenging is the myth of an all-knowing and all-seeing state, a state that can see and understand the complex social environment that is around it. In Foucault's view, it can't. It's always going to be perspectival truth claims, with state power being used to impose one particular set of perspectives or narratives on those agents who are subject to those perspectives or narratives in ways that might close down their space to exercise their creative agency or freedom. Similarly, on this kind of Foucauldian view, the idea of society itself needs to be problematized or deconstructed, because it presupposes that there is a unified entity that can be grasped from a sovereign site or point, rather than society being a kind of discursive invention, which has, as Foucault would understand it, power effects. Now, this is not because there is no such thing as the social. Okay? It does not mean that. Rather, what it refers to is the idea what we refer to as the social does not reflect a systemic unity or totality. What we call the social on a Foucauldian understanding is an emergent property that cannot fully be grasped or comprehended by totalizing theories, such as, for example, Marxism or many versions of rational choice theory that impose a unitary model of the Homo economicus. The belief that a social totality can be grasped, manipulated, managed to benefit the welfare of the population is, for Foucault, politically dangerous. So what emerges from this kind of an account is, if you like, one of pluralism against the idea of sovereignty. We need, if you like, if we take Foucault at his word, to pluralize the self, to recognize that the individual is not just one thing. The individual can become multiple different things if they're exposed, if you like, to discourses that allow that to happen. We also need to pluralize the idea of power, taking it away from just state structures, but looking at it through the discourses that operate at multiple levels of society. We also need to pluralize the state itself, to recognize that the state actually does not have a unitary view of society, but whatever views it puts forward will reflect the multiple kind of truth claims that are actually coming from actors with many different sorts of perspectives. And this implies that as intellectuals studying these kind of phenomena, we should adopt the position of what Foucault calls the specific intellectual. The intellectual who engages only with localized power struggles, not one who tries to universalize the results of those power struggles or the implications from them to develop a kind of totalizing theory or perspective about the whole of the society that the analyst purports to be trying to understand. So I hope you're starting to get a flavor of where there could be some commonalities between Foucault and the Ostroms. But what I'd like to do now is to bring those out into greater relief. So the first area where I think these perspectives can join or engage in a kind of dialogue with each other is the idea of what I'd refer to as a non-universal or culturally situated understanding of rational choice. So for Foucault, agents are strategic actors. Okay, they try to achieve objectives in the world by deploying discourse as a form of strategy or power technique. Okay, but the way in which they do that is always going to be conditional on, if you like, the cultural or discursive environment in which they are situated. Now, that I think is a strikingly similar kind of view to the kind of culturally situated rational choice that the Ostroms have. Individuals, purposeful actors trying to pursue their own goals, but they do so in an environment that is actually culturally situated. Okay, so what their sense of their rationality is conditioned by routines, or as Foucault would put it, discourses. Okay, so discourse is something that the Ostroms wouldn't necessarily use that terminology, although actually Vincent, in The Meaning of Democracy and the Vulnerability of Democracies, does use the term discourse at various points, though perhaps not in the way Foucault would understand it. But I think discourse as a strategy of rational choice and a conditioning factor on rational choice is the area where these perspectives can be combined. The second area where I think they can come into conversation and where there are profound similarities is that they are both in different ways avoiding unitary theories and the idea of a social point of view or a sovereign point of view. Okay, so for both the Ostroms and for Foucault, there is no social point of view. Okay, the state, its entanglements, and the various discourses that are operating in society, they're not controlled from any one point. They are emergent phenomena from localized power struggles. This, I think, is a critical point of agreement, if you like, between Foucault and the Ostroms. So the public choice approach that the Ostroms adopt is similar to Foucault because it looks at, if you like, the politics of multiple exchange arenas, rather than saying there being a single exchange arena. So when the Ostroms talk about action situations, they're talking about plural action situations, not a unitary action situation. So they are, if you like, engaging what Foucault would call an active decentering. They're moving away from some centralized notion of a contract to multiple decentered power struggles and the way we think about those, how those power struggles might evolve. They also share, if you like, from a normative standpoint, the idea that totalizing theories, such as a unitary model of the Homo economicus, do not work. Precisely because they're imposing a kind of scientific grid on much more varied, localized circumstances. So I think there are profound similarities between the critique of the kind of unitary rational choice model that Eleanor Ostrom puts forward in Governing the Commons, and what Foucault would understand to be a kind of power knowledge complex. So the imposition of state ownership or private property on local communities is an example of what Foucault would call a power knowledge complex, where you have experts claiming to know the truth about the common pool resources that are to be managed and to impose a unitary set of rules on those resources. So there are many parallels, as I'm sure people may already be aware, between, I think, the Ostromian critique of top-down rule and the ideas of James C. Scott in his book, Seeing Like a State. And Scott's ideas are taken essentially from Foucault. They're basically an application of this critique of biopower applied at multiple sorts of levels. So it's the claim that experts can understand or know the truth about resources, the truth about the actors who are embedded in those resources and how they should be managed that brings these perspectives into a kind of commonality. I think you can also see in this kind of analysis a concern that by being subject to these power techniques, people's identities might, if you like, be affected by these kinds of processes. So Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom are concerned about the fact that people's capacities to be self-governing agents can be denuded if they are subject to kind of top-down rule. So as Eleanor says, if somebody else says they're going to manage the resource for you, why would you even bother trying to manage the resource yourself? Well, likewise, if you're subject to a discourse that basically says you're an incompetent or incapable actor, why would you bother trying to see if you can actually exercise powers of self-governance? This is, I think, what the Foucauldian parallel would be, that people's capacities to be self-governing or self-creating agents are potentially being denuded by totalizing top-down discourses, which claim to have a kind of scientific truth about communities and the resources that they are using. I think further area where this implies commonality is the idea of social scientists as operating like specific intellectuals. So when the Ostroms talk about institutional artisanship, localized crafting of rules, they're basically acting in the way that Foucault would describe as the role of the specific intellectual. Someone who's figuring out what might work in a local situation with the knowledge of the local actors, but who is resistant to kind of applying that notion on a totalizing or society-wide level. So when Eleanor speaks about avoiding the panacea trap, I think that's precisely what she's doing. She's being a Foucauldian specific intellectual, if you like. And then a final area, I think, where there is commonality between these perspectives would be a focus on fractured political authority. Because it's going to be precisely in regimes where institutions are fractured and take multiple sorts of forms, where it is going to be less likely that you have, if you like, a process where any single discourse can colonize all of the institutions in your society. If you have a situation where the state is going beyond, if you like, that kind of dispute resolution role that the Ostroms focus on, then that state is going to become a target for discursive strategies that can lead to a kind of process of totalization. That's something I think that the idea of fractured authority or polycentricity is something that is attractive both potentially to Foucauldians and to people in the Ostromian tradition. So I want to conclude by pointing out 3 areas where I think there might be tensions between these perspectives that is something that we might want to explore. The first area where I think there could be some tension between the perspectives is on what some people might consider, and though I think arguably this is an unfair characterization, of a kind of residual scientism within the Ostrom's approach. And this would relate especially to Eleanor's focus on the design principles that come out from the institutional analysis and development framework. Now, the aim of that framework, as I understand it, was, of course, not to come out with some sort of blueprint or checklist. And one can't blame really the Ostroms for the fact that some people have interpreted it, I think, in the wrong way, as offering a kind of set of institutional panaceas. Nonetheless, despite Eleanor's potent critiques of naive positivism and behaviorism, there is still a sense from the Ostroms that they are looking for a science of association. The idea that there is a science of collective action and that there are something like laws of association that might ultimately be accessible to social scientists, even if we can't always easily access those laws. I think the Foucauldian approach, on the other hand, would incline to the view that there are no stable variables, that there are no stable laws. Different cultural environments and different sorts of subjectivity produce and may generate very different institutions and outcomes when faced with similar problems. And indeed, how problems are understood, and indeed what constitutes a problem in the first place, may vary significantly, depending on the cultural circumstances or grids of understanding that are operating with any given set of actors. So I think if we were to push the Ostromian approach in a more Foucauldian direction, it would need to move more explicitly towards a kind of interpretivist political economy framework, where the analytic narrative method that the Ostroms perfected, I think, in many ways, becomes even more micro-political, even more embedded in techniques like ethnography, for example. The second area where I think there is tension with the Ostroms centers on the question of the constitutional order and whether self-governing citizens can, if you like, be made or manufactured. So the Ostroms, although they are very much focused on kind of bottom-up ideas, still subscribe, I think, to some degree to the notion that we should try to consciously build citizens who are self-governing agents. And this is where there are many kind of commonalities that they have with what's sometimes referred to as the ordo-liberal tradition. So the ordo-liberals are very much of the view that in order to create a society which has the potential for this kind of bottom-up self-governance to operate, you consciously need, if you like, to build or construct citizens who can act in this way. Now, from a Foucauldian perspective, I think there will be skepticism about this, because this smacks of, if you like, people being given rules of self-governance rather than the subjects themselves formulating their own rules of self-governance. So there's a danger I think here from the Foucauldian perspective as what it might see as a residual commitment to kind of sovereign power in the Ostromian tradition. and certainly in the ordo-liberal tradition. So I would see Foucault as someone who is much more sympathetic to, if you like, a more, and I hesitate to use the term, anarchic conception of the public sphere. He has a more anarchic notion of the way in which people are shaped and can shape themselves as self-governing agents, as opposed to a view which implies that there is ultimately some class of experts, if you like, who can shape citizens into being self-governing actors. I think Foucauldians might say that the ordo-liberal tradition is not too far away in some of the kind of things it says to the attitudes exhibited by colonial authorities in relation to indigenous peoples, where freedom is only countenanced when, if you like, the subjects have proved themselves worthy of that freedom. It's not something they automatically have and are able to exercise. That's the kind of critique I think that the Foucauldians might make. I think the third and final area where there might be tension is that the emphasis, if you like, within the Ostroms on what I'd refer to as ordered liberty, perhaps too much emphasizes the importance of preserving a kind of cultural institutional status quo at the local level. So I think on a Foucauldian view, even if a given configuration of cultural norms and institutions produces a set of subjects who are able to overcome certain collective action problems, this does not mean that the power relations underpinning those norms and institutions should be immune from challenge. Okay, so I think for Foucault's, his social constructionism points towards the case for a certain level of, and this is the term I like to use, cultural creative destruction, that challenges the status quo and in the process brings forth new configurations, both of the individual subject and of the kind of cultural environment. And that kind of emphasis on destabilization, I think the Ostroms might see as excessive, as threatening the kind of fabric of decentralized norms and structures that might help people through various bottom-up mechanisms to overcome collective action problems. So those are my thoughts, and I hope it's some food for thought in the way in which these often what I consider to be very different traditions can productively be brought together in interesting ways. So thank you very much.
Plenty to chew on. Thank you so much. So I'm seeing lots of hands go up per our tradition. If we have any students perhaps who would like to go first. Good. Correct me if I'm wrong on who's actually a student still too. I know you are actually, Jamie. Perpetual, we're all perpetual students, I know. How about let's start over here. I'll work our way around, and then folks joining online too, I'll help keep the queue. So yes, kick us off, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. It was so informative for me. Actually, I have a question regarding your, explanation.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Sure. I have a question about the way that you explained how top-down policies or top-down approaches could fail in Ostrom point of view, that maybe they don't know how agents make decision, or they don't understand their choices. Maybe it's the other way. Maybe they really know their choices. They're totally aware of their choices, but because maybe they themselves are involved in another action situation, that their decisions could affect a very long-term or very hard, very monumental consequences, not only for the society, but also for the natural resources. Let's say, for example, two states, the governance system in the hierarchy makes some decisions regarding the fact that they know that those kinds of decisions might not be such kinds of actions that really agents really like to do those kinds of actions. So because we are not living in an isolated world, those kinds of situations could also affect our decisions. I want to know your perspective about this. How we could, do you really think that top-down decisions are always fail because they don't know really the decision making of the action agents?
Well, let me be clear on that point. So I don't think it's a case that top-down decisions always fail. Okay, so you can have a situation where a top-down action does align with, if you like, the choice situation or the kind of game scenario, if you like, of actors on the ground. But I don't think, and I think this is a point the Ostroms would make, I don't think there's any systemic reason why one would expect top-down arrangements to align in that way. Okay, so as I understand the position that the Ostroms put forward in governing the commons, it is very much that the people in the higher level agencies believe that the actors are in, if you like, at the local level, a prisoner's dilemma type situation. But actually that may not be the structure of the game as the actors on the ground perceive it. So you could have actors who are, for various reasons, encultured in a set of norms and practices that mean that they don't even consider acting as free riders, because they're so embedded in a set of routines and practices about the resources that they don't consider free riding. But the external agents who've read textbooks that say all common pool resources will be subject to free riding, if you like, then impose that model upon them. Okay, and that's what then disturbs the game situation, if you like, of the actors on the ground. So I do think the Ostroms are making an epistemic claim about the incapacity of agents in very top-down structures to understanding the games that other actors are playing. Now, is that insurmountable? Not necessarily. You might be able to think of arrangements that facilitate a kind of dialogue between more top-down and more localized sorts of agents in configuring different sets of institutional rules. I think, though, my understanding of it, the Ostroms still very much come from the idea that it's a subsidiarity model. So the local level actors will be contracting up authority to a higher level, rather than assuming that they're in a kind of branch plant relationship to a sort of super hierarchy top. So from their point of view, centralization works best when it's centralization that in some sense has been chosen by more local level actors. And I think that's very compatible with this Foucault notion as well of a kind of self-governing or self-creating set of actors who are choosing their own rules, giving themselves their own discipline, rather than being disciplined by an external force.
Let's go to the back next, if that's okay. And then, yeah, we'll turn to Jamie next and then Max after that. Yep. Are you sure? Okay, all right. Let's go you, then Max, then we'll go to you, and then it's open from. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for your stimulating talk. You mentioned that one of the 3 areas of attention is residual scientism in the Ostroms' work, and their emphasis on the science of association, for instance. But if you read Vincent's Meaning of Democracy and Vulnerability of Democracy, he is careful to emphasize the art and science of association, right from Tocqueville. So flowing from that, why did you ignore that part, first of all? And two, I think I'm kind of inclined to agree with you based on your talk. Do you think that the incentives of the academy then shape this emphasis on science, right? So that their work so that they can get grants and
yes. That is exact. So I actually don't blame the Ostroms for this. I very much blame, if you like, scientism in the US and other arenas of political science. So if you're not claiming to have evidence of some universal law operating, whether it's in quantitative work or in the kind of qualitative comparative case studies that the Ostroms produced, and offer what looks like a unifying framework, people aren't going to look at it. Well, they will, but not in the right journals, if you like. And I'm not saying, I don't think the Ostroms were particularly concerned about publishing in the right venues, but I think there is huge pressure in that direction. And this is also true at a policymaking level. Unless you're claiming some kind of panacea, then the discourse privileges actors in a sense who put forward what look like simple, easily understandable solutions. Where if you say, hey, it's all varied, it's all dependent on local contingency, there isn't as much of a market for that. So I blame that partly on the intellectual community, the intellectual discourse in political science and political economy that's resistant to the kind of interpretive method, which I think this approach kind of really does imply. But that discourse also informs the public realm more broadly. It's not just academia. It kind of they interact in multiple ways that constrain this.
So, living Max, yep.
Thank you for inspiring participation. So particularly would like to ask about how Foucault because you mentioned that Foucault took a
Interpretivist.
viewpoint on cultural circumstances, and there are no system variables as empirical social science will see it, and then it will be part of the culture, will be part of the discourse. So would it be, so how does Foucault see culture as part of the cultural creative destruction, as you say? Because the relationship between cultures and norms are pretty vague in some discussions. So yeah, could you elaborate more on that?
So what his conception of freedom and self-governance is, you can never be outside of power or culture. Okay, culture creates our sense of who we are. What he doesn't want is for people to be frozen into the particular set of understandings that that culture gives us. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to constantly reinvent yourself. It doesn't imply that, but it means that you shouldn't be prevented from reinventing yourself by, if you like, a habituated or institutionalized set of norms and practices. So resistance is when someone engages in what he calls limit experiences. That's where you're pushing the boundaries, you're challenging the boundaries of your culture, you're transgressing what is considered to be acceptable behavior. So you are, if you like, a cultural entrepreneur. Okay, you're someone who introduces a technique, a new way of being, a new expression, a new bodily comportment, whatever it might be. So he talks about, in a rather salacious way, a new economy of bodies and pleasures. Okay, to talk about destabilizing sexual norms. Now, the point there is, well, if you are coming up with a new set of practices, you are challenging the status quo. You're saying, I'm not happy with the power relations I'm in. I'm not happy with the way I'm being constructed by the society around me. So there is a kind of disputatious aspect to that, which is potentially destabilizing. Now, there are analogs in that with concerns about, in the economic realm. This is a point I make in my book, actually, that I think the kind of perspective Foucault might be sympathetic to in the economic realm is Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction in economics. So new technologies constantly destabilizing things, constantly almost requiring that people have to reinvent themselves. Okay, now Foucault might see that as quite liberating. There's a kind of pushback against that, if you like, from a more, and I mean using the term with a small c conservative direction. It's just, you don't necessarily always want to be in a society which is requiring that you innovate. Permanent innovation, permanent revolution. So there's a kind of tension between, on the one hand, the need for this creative destruction and the need to be able to push back against it. And I don't think anyone actually fully knows how to navigate that. And I think many of the tensions in today's society are actually about that tension between creativity and resistance to creativity, resistance to innovation.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, now let's go to the back end. Yes, Dan, Gustavo, Jess, great.
Yeah, around this, most of the Foucaultian part.
Yeah.
And why you would find it attractive.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that there's like the value of the processes and the institutions and the cultures and things that should be forefront to whether it's good to disrupt them, right? It's important to come in with new institutions to solve something that from the external perspective looks like a prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
To the players, right? But then the players are right about the situation. So you take different societies or different cultural groups, you got libertarians, anarchists, Nazis, I don't go down the line, right? Do we want to let them all be self-governing, or do we need some common shared constitutional norms that, solve certain kinds of problems in society? So can you say more to like motivate this worldview as why we don't need like a normative social contract with certain core principles that are shared on and some authoritative structures from the top down, because not everybody's good from the bottom,
So I think there are sets of common norms that this perspective, the way that I've sort of articulated it, would still be interested in. Okay, so Foucault, and this is where I think there are many parallels with the Ostroms, wants what he calls a pluralism of rationalities. Okay, so I mentioned that both of them have got this emphasis on pluralism. But there are going to be circumstances where those plural rationalities clash, okay, where they are in conflict. So you are going to need dispute resolution mechanisms, yeah? And those could be that could require some form of central authority. Okay, so I don't think it implies, even the more radical view that I was putting forward at the end, a total kind of anarchism in the public sphere.
Night watchmen's,
Um,
which is woefully inadequate, like.
It could be more, it could be, I think it could be more than a night watchman state, precisely because the kind of agents who are involved in these sorts of arrangements, I think on Foucault's view, could be both individualistic and communalistic. Okay, so you can have part of the self-creation process might be to create a focus on solidarity in a certain level. Okay? Now, what Foucault will be resistant to, and if I'm putting my cards on the table, I'm resistant to it as well, is universalizing that. Okay. So you wouldn't want a kind of solidarity on a unitary societal wide level. You would want local communities where that can be exercised. You would want there to be zones where solidarity can be exercised. In the same way, you would want there to be zones where individual initiative, resistance, freedom, these kind of things can be exercised. So I don't think it implies a night watchman state. It could be a state that does more than that. But there will be a strong wariness of some kind of totalizing emphasis on values like either solidarity or individualism, for that matter.
We have 7 people on the queue, so we'll keep rolling. Gustavo next, and we'll turn to Dan, Jess, and the one online.
Okay, so fascinating presentation. I'm still digesting several pieces, but so one comment, like coming to from the Ostroms and then engaging with your thing. So one way of thinking is like, okay, you can accept that communities can essentially create centralized structures. Okay, so then the problem with that is essentially that it's pretty dangerous to create decentralized structures. So now what the communities do essentially is we need to deal with this danger, but there is value in creating these structures. Okay, so at the end we need to agree on a method to deal with those potential problems of the centralized structures. Okay. And then essentially the traditional ways of doing it, it's you put institutional constraints. Essentially, whoever is ruling those centralized structures will be only ruling temporarily and with constraints. And then with this idea, essentially, you can make centralized decision making essentially acceptable for those that do not like where this is going, but they will have a chance in the future to push things back. Okay. So, and that's essentially put you in the traditional classical liberal state, at least the way I'm reading it. So the way I read the Ostroms is the Ostrom would say, okay, good. If we go to Summer of Philadelphia in 1776, it's like you put an institutional structure and a constitution to deal with that problem. And the Ostrom say, well, sorry, doesn't seem to be enough. You need other centralized authorities at different levels to make that agreement and avoid the dangers of centralized authority that we need to create something effective and then something that you can essentially make a credible commitment in the future. Because otherwise, whoever's are running these centralized authorities will go in the Foucault path, okay? So coming from that perspective, essentially, I had a really hard time kind of understanding. So I follow the Ostroms until that point, okay? So now, if you want to continue in the Foucault direction, so where do you go, essentially? I don't see, so first of all, I understand that you need some universal agreement. They need to come up with this universal agreement, at least how we are going to be ruling. So you can talk about a lot of pluralism and everything, but at the end, you have kind of a universal thing that they're going to be temporary government check and balances or something like that. Otherwise, all the other pluralism about policies and things that are implemented is a total empty. Okay. It's an empty point. Okay. Mm-hmm. So essentially, that's my first concern. And the second one is like, once you stop on the classical liberal state, so I don't see how keep going with Foucault, essentially. So you see, it's my sympathy to stay in on Ostrom's point there, okay? And not keep going. And I see the similarities, but essentially in some sense, Foucault is this extra thing that is not very clear what it is. And in some sense looks kind of inconsistent to me.
Well, let me tell you why I think what he's saying is important. It actually connects to the first part of what you said. So the way in which you describe the dangers of centralized authority, it sounds as though there is something, if you like, essential to the character of states, which leads them to act in a predatory manner. Now, Foucault actually has a term which he uses to describe that very attitude. So he calls it state phobia. And what he means by that is the idea that it's the belief that the state has an underlying essence in the way that he attacks the idea of essences at the level of the individual. And the underlying essence of the state on that view is that it has this dynamic. Now, what he's saying is it is not state structures per se that are the problem. It is state structures that have been constituted through what he would call biopolitical narratives. Okay, so it's the state seeing itself through this lens as an all-seeing, all-knowing actor that exercises power as kind of over and above other agents, that puts in train these dynamics. It is not something that is intrinsic to the idea of having a state itself. So Foucault actually looks at, well, how did states function in sort of pre-Enlightenment, in the pre-Enlightenment era, which he seems to have some kind of sympathy with. And his view is that, well, if you look at what states did in that period, there were states, but they didn't bother themselves with this thing called the welfare of the population. It was the invention of what he calls these biopolitical narratives that created the idea that there can be some sovereign view of the society that led to the very sorts of dynamics that the Ostroms are concerned about. And that you then get into the situation of having to think about what kind of rules can we have that check this. So in a sense, I think he would say you're putting the cart before the horse. Okay, you've got to understand the problem as arising from the discourse, not from the inherent features of the state itself.
Maybe I don't buy that. So it's just-
Yeah, and lots of people don't. Lots of people don't.
Dan.
Yes, a very thought-provoking presentation. I chafed a little bit at your characterization of the Ostroms because it ignored certain strands of the tradition they come out from, one of which is pragmatism.
Yeah.
Right, which Foucault cannot be alleged as the pragmatist. Right, and so Lynn famously wrote a great article with Krister Anderson on the dangers of over decentralization.
Yeah.
They didn't really talk about bottom up versus top down. That was not their way of, that was not their discourse. Right, after all. Well, you can't look at history without understanding that top down has often occurred. And what Vincent found novel about the United States was that the top down structures enabled creative potential for at least some individuals and then growing numbers of individuals. And, then Foucault has a problem with the welfare state as I guess in like contributing to his state phobia, right? Without, maybe he did appreciate the fact that the first country to create welfare states was not a liberal country at all, and that the welfare state in a way follows Sen and Nussbaum's capability approach, which is central to ideas of individual autonomy nowadays, right? So I think maybe there are some more important and central differences, right? I mean, one of the things is the Ostroms are always very careful. Polycentricity itself is not a panacea, right? Whereas it seems like maybe it is for Foucault.
No, I don't think he would say that. So he has got this famous line, which is that everything is dangerous. Okay, so he actually thinks that any institution, if it's overly institutionalized, if you like, can generate these sorts of threats. And this is where you have this permanent emphasis on destabilization, or at least the possibility of it. So he doesn't want, it's an anti-normative normativity, if you're using that kind of sort of terminology. I'd also push back slightly on your suggestion that he's somehow the antithesis of pragmatism. I don't think he is. I think the approach implies it is very pragmatic in the sense that at any point in time, you have to work with the subjects that are a product of a discourse in a particular localized situation. So if we interpret pragmatism as being, well, what can work with a particular set of actors, it's going to be very kind of incremental, evolutionary, in the sense of you've got to work with the materials that you have. You can't just sort of create something completely from scratch. You're going to have to work with those materials. So his views on the welfare state, he's not someone who's saying you can get rid of the welfare state, because we have it and we've been shaped by it. I think he would be sympathetic, or did seem to be sympathetic, to ideas about, say, having a universal basic income instead of what he would call normalizing welfare regime. So that would be an example of how you pragmatically work with the welfare institutions, not to get rid of them, but to morph them into a form which he would think is more compatible with this kind of open-ended sort of self-creation.
Then let's say we got to that form that he approved of.
Yeah.
Then would he stop wanting resistance?
Oh, no, I think he would still keep wanting resistance.
Resistance to
He would still want resistance. He would still want resistance. But in a certain sense, you are then if you are saying it's all open-ended and you're in this kind of radical pluralism type space, I don't see that as being contradictory, because everything is being subject to the same kind of treatment. So it is about keeping the field open. It wouldn't preclude experiments in centralized authority. You know, if people wanted to create a centralized authority, this was the way they expressed their self-creation. But it would be very resistant to the idea that whoever has that notion imposes it on a society-wide basis. I think you'll be very skeptical of that. And that I do see as being a commonality with
That comes right out. So that comes right out of Mill.
Who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew how timely this discussion would be? Jess, please.
So agreed that it's very thought provoking. I'm not sure exactly how well formulated these are, so that's my caveat. The first is sort of just pushing back on what not institutionalized is.
Yeah.
Right, because I like, is that the way you've described it, that's just like a constant state of uncertainty and instability,
Yeah.
right? And is that really what Foucault would be arguing for? I certainly don't think that the Ostroms would necessarily support that version. So just sort of wanting to push back on whether is there sort of a form of institutional robustness and flexibility that could facilitate the kind of opportunities for protest and self-realization would be another way to say that you're talking about. So that's one. The second is, if we're gonna sort of read into the Ostroms as far as we are in many of these things in terms of what they would say, it strikes me that like we really need to take seriously the idea that the nature of the problem matters. So you put out there that like that the idea that well, what even constitutes a problem is a subjective perspective, right? But and I think they would agree with that. But they're also saying that not only is there no panacea of answers or methodologies for studying or understanding something, perspectives, that the nature of the problem that whatever perspective is yielding is out there, demands particular sets of understandings, right, to address. And so I only bring this up because we've sort of talked about the economic realm. We've also done a very general politicized realm. And I mean, a micro version of this is that lobsters and cows are not the same thing, right? But the broader version of this is like bodily expression and deviance may be very different than what we think of as the collective action problem of yielding particular economic outcomes, which I understand the point of talking about those in this way, but I'm sort of curious how you are thinking about the extent to which Foucault and or the Ostroms might think about different logics applying to different domains. And the final question is whether you have read Abby Ennis's new book and what you think about it. Which is the, I don't know if you've heard, it's coming out of LSE. It's the The post-Soviet Brit?
Yes, I do. I have read that book. I
Okay.
have read that book.
It seems very much in line with this question of the logic of being able to have a scientific plan that you then impose on a society and can realize is similar across communist and
Yeah.
liberal democratic
Yeah.
states.
Let me come to that,
Sorry.
because that's a big question.
Sorry.
But on
Later conversation.
the other point, I think Foucault would be emphasizing, and I think I can see this in the Ostroms, especially actually in Vincent. The argument is that what people call collective action problems are social constructions. Whether something is a collective action problem is not objectively given, even by the character of the resource. So the character of the resource, I think you could include in what Foucault might understand to be non-discursive structures. Okay, so there is a reality, like there is some kind of physical reality that we have to deal with. But whether or not that reality translates into what we would call a collective action problem is going to depend on the logics that are created by, as he would understand it, the discourses within which people are situated. So the issue is going to be, do you have a discourse that, for example, universalizes a particular form of the homo economicus, and that basically says everybody's going to free ride given half a chance? Yeah. And if you have that discourse, well, then you may actually create collective action problems by constructing agents who behave in that way within the terms of that kind of discourse. Whereas, if you have a set of arrangement, if you're in an environment where that isn't, if you like, the monopoly discourse, there are other narratives about people's potential to be self-governing, then other possibilities may arise. So I think this goes to the first point you're making about what do I mean by institutionalization. And I think there, what I'm referring to specifically is a kind of alignment or tight fit, if you like, between formal institutions and discursive structures. Okay, so if you had, for example, a situation where you had, and this is just a stylized example to kind of try and bring this out, a kind of monopoly narrative that was the kind of homo economicus model. And that aligned with your public policy institutions in quite a centralized state, so that all what we call common pool resources are managed through either a top-down privatization model or a top-down state ownership model. That very structure would prevent people from seeing other possibilities. And this is where I see the importance in Foucault, if you like, of the polycentricity aspect, because it's polycentricity, the fact that there are different centers doing potentially different things, that exposes people to other ways of being. Okay, whereas if you have a tight alignment between a kind of formalistic legal structure and a discourse, that blocks people from seeing, well, hey, these people figured out how to do it themselves. Why can't we? If no one is allowed to, because there's such a tight fit between the discourse and the formal structures, then you block the scope for that kind of what Foucault will call these kind of limit experiences. So the term he uses, I didn't mention it in my talk, is heterotopia, which is the idea that there is some space outside of the norm that can act as a kind of learning or source of reflexivity for other actors. Now, in his book, the final point, there are many aspects of that book I like, because she's pointing out how a certain form of economic liberalism, which is a kind of managerialist form of it, has many similarities with a kind of central planning model of socialism. I like the attack on, if you like, the scientistic model. What I find utterly bizarre about the book is in her normative analysis at the end, she goes about proposing something that sounds very, very scientistic and very, very managerialism. She just doesn't like the particular model of managerialism that there is in the UK, but she's not actually a critic of managerialism per se. I think if she was in charge of the managerial model, she'd be quite happy with it. But that's maybe a little bit unfair.
Yeah.
I bet
I
so.
have one comment on this, but not related to your last comment, to the previous,
Yeah.
but it goes in both directions. You can say, like, if people are only experimenting with self-governing institutions, they never learn that maybe they could do better with centralized institutions.
So they would I think they would in a polycentric structure, precisely because in the Ostrom's case, It is by local agents creating a centralized authority that others can see working that would enable others potentially to copy it. But so you must have islands of experimentation that are either decentralized or centralizing that enable other agents to see an alternative. If you have a monolith that mandates that it must only be decentralized or mandates that it must only be centralized, then you've got a problem.
And we still have that in the American political tradition. New Harmony, Indiana is an example. An experiment that failed.
There you go. No, that's right. I don't want to ignore Anas Malik's comment. It was in the chat. You can't see it right now, but let me just read it.
Yeah.
It does evoke Vincent. So Anas was asking, how would Foucault's perspective relate to Vincent's notion of covenant and the golden rule and as metaphysics of citizenship in self-governing society? That was on Final Jeopardy last night. I'm not sure. Yeah, I can read it again. How would Foucault's perspective relate to Vincent's notion of covenant and the golden rule as metaphysics of citizenship in self-governing society?
You read Vincent's last book, so you can't
Yeah.
come out saying you've not seen it.
Well, I think it would relate to the idea, if I'm understanding it right, to the idea of people being able to enter into covenants with others through some kind of notion of a self-governing respect. So this kind of emphasis on artisanship. So it would be about some kind of more egalitarian contracting arrangement that people can experience as a form of self-governance. So the use of the sword function is something that's being constructed by the actors. So this doesn't preclude the idea, I think, that this is a great mistake that people make about Foucault. He is not opposed to the idea of, say, for example, disciplinary power as such. He wants people to have scope to adopt their own disciplines, not to be always disciplined by a kind of external force. But the problem is not with the disciplinary idea itself. It's where it comes from.
Yeah.
You can never completely escape from the fact that we're always going to be subject to disciplines we haven't chosen, but you need at least some space to create your own. So if people through kind of bottom-up arrangements can practice their own contractual arrangements, even creating ones where there are enforcement mechanisms that are like the sword function, if you like, then I don't see that as being incompatible with the kind of view that he would have. I don't know whether that answers it, but that's the best I can do.
I think it's helpful, yeah. And they can weigh in and ask. But we have Mike next and then Claudia.
Yeah, thanks, Honest, for that setup. That was a nice sort of connecting the covenants, similar to what I'm sort of doing. This is great stuff. I mean, it's fascinating hearing you describe the Ostroms because you're spot on. And I'm assuming you're spot on with Foucault because I've never acquired that date. But I think there's a piece missing here somehow in the connection. I think it's an interesting connection. And when I've had troubles over the years trying to explain to students how this relates to either Foucault or Giddens or some other structural source of, the best I've come up with is that the Ostromian approach is radically endogenous, that all the constraints that these boundedly rational actors face have been constructed by other actors, boundedly rational actors. I kind of wonder maybe not the evolutionary stuff, but ignore that for now. But that so everything that is every part of the cultural context that we're involved, that individuals are involved in if they're engaged in a collective action problem, an action situation, action arena. You can back up and try to understand where that situation was determined. Okay. And I think what's missing in Foucault is a sense of where do these discourses come from? Okay. And I think from the Ostroms' perspective, they would come from collective action, successful collective action on the part of other groups, or that same group before, or that group's ancestors who wrote the Constitution or something. That it's not just out there. The discourse is not out there. The discourse is itself a consequence of collective action. And this is where I think it ties into your comment about the Ostroms having a residual scientism to them. I like that concept. I don't like the word scientism, but I like that because you read Vince's book his last book on the vulnerability of democracy and whatever. He would argue very strongly that there are certain universals in that all communities face certain kinds of generic problems. One of which always stuck with me was teamwork. We all kind of understand what teamwork is. Now, what the team's for, what's involved work, what's seen as work versus being play and all that, that's all culturally determined. But there's this general sort of problem. And I think that for the Ostroms, there is a universal problem or a universal set of dilemmas that are triggered or are present in any kind of collective action problem. Okay. And what Lynn was really pushing for, and you see this in her understanding institutional diversity, was to having a science of understanding where institutions come from and then how do they shape people's perception. You drew on Hardin for a very nice example of this, saying that he would say that free riding is universal. And so you have to go to these sort of two outcomes. Well, I think the Ostroms would say, yes, free riding is universal. There's a possibility in the way individuals see themselves and the way this community is defined. But in certain circumstances, that problem can be overcome by the institutionally constructed institutions for collective management in some sense, okay? So the problem's there, but there are ways out of it. And I think that would be the focus of the science or the art and science of association, would be on understanding how communities first get together to form what the problem is they're trying to solve, okay? And that framing sort of sets then the context for the later discussions and going in there. So in a sense, and that's, like I said, that's where the discourse come from. So the discourses are not something out there. There's something that's also part of this same system that is created by the Ostroms. And I don't know quite how you handle that, but I will say one other point related to what you're saying here before. The Ostroms, there is a focus on the localness of Foucault, something I hadn't thought of. So that's an interesting way that if he's really that radically interested in that, the only expertise is really local expertise, and local knowledge was something that the Ostroms were very respectful of and stuff like that. But it wasn't that local is always good, because Lynn would always emphasize, there are local tyrannies. Okay, well, where did she come up with this sense of that something's a tyranny? Okay, and I don't think she would say that we always sort of know what a tyranny, but if the local community feels they're in a tyrannical sort of situation, then they are, and they will need to face these problems of collective action to get out of it. And they can draw on this institutional analysis, which Lynn also emphasized in her work, that's not as well known, some of her work. The tools of institutional analysis and collective action should be a required aspect of any civic education course to run a democracy. Okay. It's not just learning about the rules of the Constitution, all that. It's learning about how to work out this teamwork sort of stuff. So I think there's a connecting thread here that sort of ties these pieces together, but it's sort of expanding the framework to understand that this discourse is itself generated by the same kinds of collective action that generate all these other kinds of institutions, including the disciplinary restrictions and stuff that you sort of approach it. So I just like kind of get your response to, does that make sense?
No, it does. And you're engaging in fundamental questions that I do to some extent actually address in the book.
Yeah. I read some of your book before, so that.
So let me start with the first one. Where does discourse come from?
Yeah.
And on Foucault's view, we are both produced by discourse and we are simultaneously using discourse as a strategy to influence others, or as he would put it, to try to conduct the conduct of others. So we're never doing that outside of discourse. We haven't created the discourse ourselves. It itself is an emergent property. I actually argue in the book, and I'll speak in my talk to the PPE group this evening. I'll be mentioning that there are many analogues, quite unusually you might think, between Foucault's understanding of how a discourse forms and a kind of Hayekian understanding of spontaneous order. It's a emergent property. So you have multiple actors who are trying to conduct the conduct of others through a kind of Nietzschean will to power. But what emerges from that is not intended by any of the individuals themselves. It assumes another level, operating a kind of almost above the individual actors. Now, this then connects to the next point, well, which is why do some of these discourses prevail over other discourses? And at that point, I think you're into evolutionary territory. Look, if there are multiple discourses, perhaps some discourses better gel with some underlying reality that could be there better than others. They may not necessarily reflect that reality, but they could be closer to it. Just in the same way that in a business setting, the firms that stay profitable aren't necessarily ones that know why they're profitable. They just happen to have hit on by accident the right production or methods or marketing techniques that enable them to perpetuate. Even if the entrepreneurs themselves, they could even have the wrong theory about why they are successful, but they could still survive. And I think you can have an analog to that in this kind of discursive realm. I don't think Foucault is necessarily committed to the idea that there's no reality at all, even about human beings. But I think what he would want to say is that we're never sure whether we have access to it or whether it is just part of these power plays. That's why he wants the experimentation. So it's the idea that you may have discovered the truth that he thinks is the real danger. Because when you think you've discovered the truth, why would you bother looking any further? So in that case, we should keep this looking process ongoing. So that's how I see it.
No panacea thing, Lynn, we're all.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it helps.
I know that we could go all afternoon, guys, but with both Claudia and I just have been really patient. So I'm wondering, would you both like to do a quick lightning round of a quick question or a comment? And then we don't have to stop, but maybe we'll just, for those who do need to leave, we can take a pause and then continue the discussion from there. So.
Thank you, Sherry. I wonder, within all this conversation, I didn't hear anything about timing. And I think that this is very important here, especially when we are talking about change of institutions. When is the right time to do that? When is the right time to not to emphasize institutionalization, but to emphasize creation of new structures? That is my short question.
Timing and Aisha. Good.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was thinking about, the larger argument that when he engages with the universal ideas, the ideas that create tenacious, there's something about universal in Foucault's own thought too, right? And that universal is that there's bio and there's politics, there's material and there's culture that kind of continues to exist. And thinking about that, and thank you for talking about heterotopia. I was thinking, well, as a geographer of politics of scale, in this. I was thinking about, a certain distinction that continues to survive with kind of a binary opposition or a dialectic, so to say, that continues to survive in both Ostroms and in Foucault, which is, this distinction between the knowing and being. A knowing and being, which is again kind of reified or solidified in the distinction between the academy and the quote unquote field.
Yeah.
Right. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on either of those kind of larger set of ideas give us a way out of that kind of binary where the academy and the field do not sort of reconstitute and continue to survive in this kind of dichotomous relationship. Thank you.
So on the point about, can you just go back to the first point about scale? I've just lost my thread momentarily. What was the first point you made about scale?
About the universality of their own thought.
Okay, yeah. So I think the universal aspect in Foucault is that individuals have got a will to power. So this is the Nietzschean aspect. So what he believes is that, like Nietzsche did, people always try to impress themselves on the world. Not only on the physical world, but also on the social world. They try to assert some kind of positionality in relation to other actors. And power relations emerge from these attempts to conduct the conduct of others. So all he means by power is just getting people to do things that you want them to do. And power structures are the emergent properties from that. They're not owned by specific actors. They're not possessed. They're these kind of emergent sort of facilitating forces or constraining forces that emerge from these kind of interactions. So the universal for Foucault is the will to power. I think the universal for the Ostroms is that agents are purposeful actors. You know, they're trying to achieve things in the world, but they're doing so in an environment that is not of their own making.
And they're doing it collectively.
Yeah, and they're doing it with other people. Yeah. So, and that is also, I think, in Foucault as well, that this is not an atomistic process. It's always going to be happening in social situations. So they are, in different ways, subscribing to a form of individualism, but it is this situated individualism. And that's a term that I use very much in this book, like a culturally situated individualism. Now, the final point about getting away from these sorts of binaries, I think that is what the idea of people as being artisans and Foucault's idea of the specific intellectual is getting at. So it's about, I wouldn't say it's about removing distinctions completely between, say, intellectuals and people in civic life or in their private life, but it's about flattening hierarchies. It is about a kind of more reflexive set of relationships where, if you like, people who previously have been subjected to expertise are the source of the expertise, and that you can actually have interchange between these certain sorts of actors so that you're constantly flipping around the relationships. But we're not always clear who the intellectual is. We're not always clear who the expert is.
Who's specific intellectual then?
Well, the specific intellectual is going to vary. So it could be like, it could be me, it could be you speaking to a particular set of actors. But on the other hand, it could be that that actor is very much educated by people through the experiments that they conduct, through the heterotopias, where you're not actually engaging with the person, but you change their perspective because you can do something different. Yeah. So I think the key, and I think what unites Foucault and the Ostroms is an idea of reflexivity on multiple levels. So if it's about pluralism, it's about learning, it's about discovering new possibilities, then it's how do people engage in that kind of reflexive process. That's the way I see it.
Any final thought on timing from Claudia's?
Timing. Well, I think I think it goes back to the previous point. I don't think we necessarily know, do we, what that balance is. There's not going to be a universal answer to the question of timing any more than there is to any of these other issues. I'm not sure whether saying that helps us, but at least if we know that's what the challenge is, perhaps we can avoid worse possibilities. But I don't really have any better answer than that, I'm afraid.
So stimulating. Thank you so much, Mark. This was